critical is a characteristic of some who use the word science. What people have said generally, I don't have much to disagree with. I'm generally in agreement, particularly with the way Frank laid it out, but also the others. But I believe that although I don't disagree with anything said, I think something else needs to be said. Something else needs to be said about what critical is. So far, we haven't really touched that point. What is critical? Not in terms of policy studies, but just in general. And for that, I would say that a point touched on by Frank and Rosanna, I think, emphasized it more, is that needs to be highlighted is reflexivity. And also the question is, what does reflexivity mean? And for that, I will turn to something someone said about 100 years ago at the age of 22, who said, this will give away who it is to some people, we must, as part of our study, expose ourselves to ourselves. That was Harold Laswell in his first book. And that brief statement contains a lot that can be unpacked, but I'm not going to go into that now, particularly the word expose, which is no accident that he chose that. But the psychoanalytic resonance of this statement is pretty clear, and that's brought in again with something he said about a quarter of a century later, that it is insufficiently acknowledged that the role of scientific work in human relations is freedom rather than prediction. By freedom is meant the bringing into focus of awareness of some feature of the personality which has hitherto operated as a determining factor upon the choices made by the individual, but which has been operating unconsciously. So what we have there is pretty clearly a conception which is a conception which has a lot of Enlightenment baggage with it, if you want to use that term. That I'm trying to suggest that the idea of critical is bound up with the Enlightenment. And for that, I want to turn briefly to Foucault and his response to Kant in What is Enlightenment? And I'll read a brief passage and then comment on it. The critical ontology of ourselves has to be considered not certainly as a theory, a doctrine, nor even as a permanent body of knowledge that is accumulating. It has to be conceived as an attitude, an ethos, a philosophical life in which the critique of what we are is at one and the same time the historical analysis of the limits that are imposed on us and an experiment with the possibility of going beyond them. I do not know whether it must still be said today that the critical task entails faith in enlightenment. I continue to think that this task requires work on our limits, that is, a patient labor giving form to our impatience for liberty. So in this response to Kant, Foucault strikes an ambivalent posture towards the Enlightenment, but nonetheless affirms an ethos oriented to freedom, not as an empty promise, but as a critical task, requiring, as he puts it, work on our limits, that is, a patient labor giving form to our impatience for liberty. Now, this passage either indicates that speaking of us, of we, and what we are doing is consistent with Foucault's post-structuralism, or it is a context within which he places his post-structuralism. So with this, what we have then is the idea of freedom, and that freedom is the key here we find in Foucault, and I think that is the same as in Laswell. And now coming back to an earlier point, whatever differences there might be between Foucault and Habermas, Habermas says that what distinguishes the critical is an interest in emancipation. And that emancipation begins with ourselves. It's not simply a matter of denouncing what we don't like. That's not critical. That's just denouncing what we don't like. It's rather, first of all, the inquirers must expose themselves to themselves. The accent of that is on freedom of the freeing inquiry. And so that would be the main point that I would make about what critical is. It certainly can lead into everything everyone else has said here, but I don't think that we can simply say critical, take a leap to say, oh, they're wrong, we're right. It's rather, we have to look at how we have been shaped, how we are always, in part, wronged, because we can't be otherwise. That's all I got to say on that.